Good evening. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the School of Business Administration at George Washington University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this episode and this session of George Talks Business Series. Today's special episode is sponsored by Steve Ross, who is our alum of the School of Business. And our special guest today is David Rubenstein, who is the co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group, which is a private equity firm. The Carlyle Group overall, I believe, is one of the largest and most successful private investment firms in the world, with managing over $200 billion, with offices from all across the world, for that matter. Now, David, first of all, welcome. I was looking at your bio and a long list of accomplishments. We had a podium to read it out, but that would take half of this hour. And obviously, I could not help but notice that that bio itself was bigger than my resume, so I felt a little bit intimidated. And therefore, we sat down and prepared all these notes to bring to this conversation today. And then I was hearing one of the interviews in which you said you don't use any notes in your show. By the way, we love that show that you have, where you are interviewing so many wonderful celebrities and people. And of course, you don't use notes because you said you like to make eye contact.
That's right.
And when you make eye contact, it's more personal, more intimate, it's a better conversation. And that kind of threw up all plans of having notes. So I invited my colleague, Professor Rodney Lake, who is in the finance department, who is also the director for the Investment Institute. This way, we will be able to use our notes, and one of us will try to make eye contact with you during this conversation, if that's okay with you.
No problem at all.
So,
Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for being here and being generous with your time, especially on a day when the traffic has been so miserable in DC. I hope you did not encounter that. But let's start with the beginning. Let's start with that you come from a family, you grew up in Baltimore in the 1950s. Your parents did not go to college. They were not really from a wealthy family, from what I understand. And yet you have been a very successful person with a lot of accomplishments. When was it that you realized that you could be so successful, and how did you start? And can you take us to the early part of your career?
Well, my parents, I'm an only child, and I grew up in Baltimore, as you said. And Baltimore was a blue-collar town. My father dropped out of high school to go into World War II. He met my mother when he got back. She was 17 when she got married. He was 20. I was the only child. I was born more than 9 months after they were married. Many times, if you have a last name like Rubenstein, you would say, well, the person's father might be a lawyer or doctor. But as I like to remind people, there are plenty of blue-collar Jews, and my family was part of them. In fact, in Baltimore was the most rigidly segregated city in the United States by religion, because in this country, we had restrictive covenants on mortgages for much of our history. And restrictive covenant means you can't sell a home to, let's say, somebody's black or somebody's Jewish. The Supreme Court outlawed that in the Shelley v. Kramer case in 1948. But Baltimore never quite got the word. So they were still having restrictive covenants. So if you were Jewish, you couldn't buy a home from people who were not Jewish, and you had to live in a certain area. So we lived in a kind of a Jewish ghetto. And in hindsight, as I look back on it, it was a great advantage growing up without a lot of money. My three children have a disadvantage. Now, people will laugh at that. You can't quite say that publicly. If you're running for office, people make fun of you. But if you grow up with no real money, but you have the unconditional love of your parents, that's probably all you really need, because if you're willing to work hard, you can accomplish something in this country. And so if you grow up in a very, very wealthy family, the ability to have drive and ambition might not be there. Many people who are wealthy have children who have enormous problems because the children have grown up in an overly wealthy setting where they probably were spoiled or had overly too many privileges. If you grow up in a family where your father makes about $8,000 a year, the house I grew up in was 800 square feet, very small. It makes you think, you've got to, if you want to get somewhere in this world, you've got to work hard and develop your own skills, and you can't depend on your parents to do something for you. So it's a great advantage in hindsight to grow up in this situation. At least I found it to be an advantage. At the time I was doing it, I can't say I thought it was an advantage because a lot of my friends were wealthier, and I read about people much wealthier. I thought it was a great advantage for them. But in hindsight, it worked out okay for me.
So for your parents, you've highlighted a few things for lessons learned. Could you maybe isolate one thing that you would say that is the most valuable lessons learned from your parents?
Well, let me put it this way. I tell students all the time that there are certain skills that you should try to learn. And one of them, my parents really worked hard on it with me, and I'll tell you what the 3 skills are. I think students today should learn how to read and appreciate books. I try to read an enormous amount of books a year because I love books, and my parents couldn't really afford to buy a lot of books. So there was a library near me. When I was 6 years old, you could have a library card. You could take out 12 books a week. I took them out, and I read them all that day, and then I had to wait a week before I could take out more books. But I love reading books because it focuses the mind. You can learn so much, and it gives you a whole new world and new perspective. My parents really worked hard on helping me read, and most people learn to read in part by help of their parents. And I've gotten very involved in literacy and literacy efforts because I really think it's a sad situation in this country that roughly 14% of the adults in this country cannot read. They're functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 3rd grade level. That's 32 million Americans. If you can't read, you are not likely to do very well in our system. And 80% of the people who are in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. 2/3 of the people in our federal criminal system and in prisons are functionally illiterate. So reading has always been important to me. And 2 other skill sets that I would recommend to students is actually learn how to persuade people of your thoughts by learning how to write very well, and not just a tweet, but something that has more thought to it, and practice writing and writing over and again. So when you write something, people might be persuaded what you say, and then learning how to talk publicly, practicing how to speak. Because when you think about it, what is life all about in terms of getting certain things done? It's really about persuading somebody to do what you want. If you want to be a leader, you can't be a leader by not having any followers. And how do you get followers? Well, you get followers by talking well, persuading them to speak, to follow you. Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, whoever you might want to cite. Or learning how to write well so you can persuade people to follow what you think by your writing. There's a 3rd way to do it, which is also important, which is the learning how to lead by example, persuading people by example. George Washington at Valley Forge, he was sitting there. He could have gone to the Ritz-Carlton or the Hilton equivalent, but he stayed there with his troops to show them that he was with them, even though they were all in very bad shape. Then he could have chosen to move away from them. So I tell students to kind of learn these skills, and my parents really helped me, to answer your question specifically. They focused on reading as a way to get out of the kind of blue-collar environment in which I'd grown up and to kind of make something of myself.
One more follow-up question on that. So there's some first-generation college students here at GW. You are first-generation, right, as you mentioned. Any advice for those students?
When I went to college, I went to Duke, and there, I was lucky, I guess, to get in. I got there because I went there because I got a scholarship. It wasn't a basketball scholarship, I assure you. I was the only person in Duke's history to get cut from an intramural basketball team when there were only 4 other people on the team. I'd say that today we've given these people who have my kind of situation a title first generation. It wasn't known as that then. It was, you were lucky to get in because generally if your parents hadn't gone to college, you had a harder time to getting in. The problem that first generation students often have in colleges, and I would say the leading universities in the country today, if you look at the statistics, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Duke, GW, others, they all have roughly 12 to 15% first generation, somewhere in that neighborhood. Maybe some are slightly higher. But being a first generation student doesn't mean that you are going to necessarily, because you got into school, going to do well there. And so at Duke, I helped put together a program where you give extra financial and counseling help to first generation students. Just because they got in doesn't mean that they're going to be able to adapt to this environment. They may have come from a family where the parents might not have been literate. They may not even have 2 parents. They might have 1 parent. And so you have a first generation student going to school. He or she may not be able to go out and have pizza with their friends because they can't afford it. Or they may not be able to go in a fraternity or sorority. Or they just can't really live the life that a college student should live. So I think universities should recognize that admitting a first-generation student is nice, but unless you do something to help them along the way, they're going to not get the experience out of college that somebody who is not a first-generation student probably does get out of the college.
Thank you. Another question, maybe switching topics a little bit. So fast forward, you went to Duke for undergrad, you went to University of Chicago for law school, and then you can fill in the blank here. But then at 27 years old, you ended up just down the street here at the White House, the Deputy Director for Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor for President Carter. How did this come about?
Well, not to the country's good fortune, I guess. But what happened is, when I was growing up, if you wanted to make a lot of money, it was relatively unusual because in the days in the 50s and 60s, the people that went into business, honestly, they went into their family-owned business or they went into a large corporation, J.P. Morgan, Procter & Gamble. There were no hedge funds, private equity funds, startups, and so forth. The idea of making a lot of money quickly was just not there. And I didn't have any money. I didn't aspire to have any money. I didn't know anything about business. My goal was to follow what John Kennedy had said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Go into public service. That was my goal. And so I figured if I was a lawyer, I could eventually go into government service and help my country in some modest way. And so I eventually went to work for a man who was the senator from Indiana running for president of the United States in 1976. I thought he was very qualified to be president. His name was Birch Bayh. I became his chief counsel at the age of 25. And about a month afterwards, he dropped out of his presidential campaign, showing my political acumen wasn't so great. And so then, as will happen to all of you perhaps, I got lucky, and you may get lucky at some point in your career. Birch Bayh dropped out. He went back to the Senate. There wasn't much to do. I got a call from somebody I didn't even know. It said, would you like to interview with Jimmy Carter? And I said, well, Jimmy Carter, isn't that the peanut farmer from Georgia? They said, yeah, but they said he's going to be the Democratic nominee. And I said, well, sure, but he's not going to win. But anyway, I had nothing better to do. I got an interview, and I got the job. So I went down to Atlanta, and I was one of the young staffers they had brought down from Washington. They would call them carpetbaggers to help Carter in the general election campaign. And then Carter, when I joined, Carter was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford, and when I finished, Carter won by 1 point. Because I loved working in the White House. I didn't do anything but work in those 4 years, and I got to know Carter's positions, and I traveled with him, Camp David, Marine One. It was great. And so again, I got lucky. I wasn't qualified, and unfortunately, I got inflation to 19%, which led to Carter not getting reelected.
So when Carter did not get reelected, it must have been a very difficult circumstance for you. You were unemployed. What did you learn from that experience? And a follow-up to that, yes, David, would be, in D.C., you have largely remained apolitical. Was that because Carter did not get reelected?
No. Well, let me explain. They're two different questions. Let me explain. Again, all of you who are students will probably have this experience, unfortunately. People tell you how great you are, but then later they'll tell you how ungreat you are. So when people wanted to lobby me and get something for me at the White House in an appropriate way, they'd say, their position is this, and could I have a meeting with them or listen to their position? I would listen, and they would call me later and say, thanks for listening to us. And by the way, if you ever want a job, call me up. Now, they shouldn't be saying that when you're in the White House, but okay. But I always said, look, I'm going to be in the second term of Carter. I'll be the senior domestic advisor in the second term, so why would I want to leave and so forth? Well, I also thought, Carter would certainly get reelected because he was a very smart person. He knew the issues well. He read everything. He was really good. And I said, we're going to run against a man who can't possibly get elected. He's too conservative. He's a movie actor. And besides, he's 69 years old. How can anybody 69 years old get up out of the morning and actually run for president? He's too old. Of course, I'm now 70, so 69 doesn't seem so old now. I was then 31. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes you get it. We desperately wanted to run against Ronald Reagan, and he clobbered us. So the day after we lost the election, I started calling all the people who told me how great I was, and they wanted to hire me and so forth. I said, okay, I'm now available. But none of them called me back because I'm out of power. Who wants to know how the Carter White House works? Who wants to be able to have influence in the Carter administration when there's no Carter administration? So unfortunately, I had a dark period in my career, and in hindsight, it may have been good, and I hope all of you have this kind of experience as well, because it'll probably make you a stronger person. All these people didn't want to hire me. And although I'd practiced law for 2 years in New York a little bit, and I had worked in the White House for 4 years, nobody wanted a then 31-year-old person who only practiced law 2 years, had expertise in the Carter administration. So I interviewed with all the law firms, but none of them wanted to hire me because I really didn't have any specialty. I didn't want to tell my mother that nobody wanted to hire me, so I say, well, I have so many offers, I don't know which one to take. So the January, February, March, April, May, June, she said, well, just take one offer. Take any offer. So finally, in June, I did take an offer, and but it took me a while to get one, and it was to be really starting at the bottom again. And once again, I realized I wasn't a great lawyer, which was good to know, because if you're good at something or really good at it, you'll probably keep doing it. And if you're Peter Principled at something, are you all too young to know what a Peter Principle is? No, nobody knows what that is. Peter Principle means that you basically can rise up to the level of your incompetence. And when you keep rising up to your level of incompetence, then you stop when you've reached a point where you're you're not competent to be above a certain level. So I was Peter principled in the sense that I wasn't a very good lawyer, and I knew that I wasn't a very good lawyer. And by not being a good lawyer, it gave me the ability to think about what I could do that I was better at. If I was a very good lawyer, I would be practicing law in Washington, D.C. now, because I was good enough to get clients and good enough to develop a legal practice. But not being good at it, I found an opportunity to do something else. On the political situation, it's this. I'm the chairman of the Kennedy Center, and I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian, and I'm chairman of the Library of Congress Board, and I'm president of the Economic Club of Washington, and I chair the Council on Foreign Relations. All of those positions, you could be political, but I think it's much better for me to be apolitical. So I don't give money to any politician. I don't go to any fundraisers. I don't support anybody. And I just think being apolitical enables me to get more things done. So let me describe what I mean. I don't lobby Congress and so forth because I just don't want to be in that business. But I started a program 5 years ago to educate members of Congress about American history. And what I do is once a month, I take a great historian like Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough, and I take them to Congress, and I have a dinner for members of Congress, and I tell them to sit with people from the opposite party at the dinner so you can get to know people from the opposite party. People won't, no press will see you, you won't be criticized for it. Then I interview the historian, and then I try to get the members of Congress to learn a little bit more about history. I have a book coming out in a couple of weeks about this called The American Story, of the best of some of those interviews. If I was very active as a Democrat or very active as a Republican, I don't think I could draw 250 members of Congress to these events because they would say he's a Democrat, he's a Republican. So I know all the people running for president on the Democratic side. I know President Trump. I've met with him a number of times, and I know these people. But I think by being apolitical, I can do my jobs in this nonprofit area better.
That makes total sense. So let me ask you, let's fast forward a little bit, because it's a big change to be going from that to opening the Carlyle Group when you were 37 years old.
Right.
And it's also curious as to why you chose D.C. versus normally one would expect that to be New York City, for example.
Well, the quote I like to give when people think about that is this. There was a Senate minority leader named Everett Dirksen around the 1960s. He was the minority leader for Republicans, and it was he who really helped get the civil rights legislation in 1964 through, because Lyndon Johnson, then president, knew Dirksen, and Dirksen rounded up Republican votes for it. Dirksen once said, when you're getting kicked out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? It means take advantage of the situation you find yourself in. So I'm in Washington, D.C. I have no investment banking background. I don't know anybody really in the investment banking world. But I said, I'm going to start a private equity firm, the first one in Washington. So by being the first one in Washington, I could get a little more attention because nobody else was doing it. And secondly, if I'd gone to New York with no investment banking experience, people would have made fun of me. So what I did is I said, there's an advantage to being in Washington. Let me tell you what the advantage is. I'm like getting kicked out of town and pretending you're leading a parade. I can understand companies more heavily affected by the federal government than those guys in New York. So if I'm looking at buying an aerospace defense company or telecommunications company, they're heavily regulated by people in Washington. I understand what the regulators think better than the guys in New York, and therefore let me have your money to invest in these kind of companies. And people say, well, it seems to make sense. So I kind of took advantage of the situation, and I happen to be living here, and it was just easier to do that.
So let me follow up on that. You have been with the same co-founders for more than 30 years. That's longer than most marriages last. So you must like them.
Yes.
And and also, you have built a big organization. At this point, it would be very interesting to know what characteristics you look for when you are recruiting people to work with you.
So when I was starting the firm, I started it then because two things propelled me to do it. I read about a man named Bill Simon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury under Gerald Ford. He left and when Carter was in office, and he then did something called a leveraged buyout. And I didn't really know what that was, but I read that he put in $1 million of his own money and made $80 million in 2.5 years, buying a company called Gibson Greeting Cards. So I thought that's better than practicing law, $1 million to $80 million. So I went down the street to see Bill Miller, who was Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter years, and said, your predecessor did a leveraged buyout. You must be able to know what a leveraged buyout is. I'll come and do the legal work for you. Let's start a leveraged buyout firm. And obviously, knowing my legal skills weren't that great, he didn't want to do it. And so I had to go get some other people. And it took me a while to find people, and I couldn't really find people. But then I read something else that made me want to move forward. I read that on average, an entrepreneur will start his or her first company between the ages of 25 and 37. And after the age of 37, your chance of doing it goes way down. And I read that when I was 37. So I figured, if I don't do a leveraged buyout firm by, now, I'll never be an entrepreneur because I'll get a mortgage, I'll have kids, I'll have all kinds of things that will keep me from wanting to take a risk. So I did it then, and it was risky at the beginning. But if you take a look at any company that starts, it's risky in the beginning. I knew Jeff Bezos when he was starting. When Jeff Bezos started, I didn't think it was going to get anywhere. He didn't have any bibliography of books in print. He came to one of our companies and said, I'll give you a third of a new company I'm starting if you let me use your bibliography of books in print, since I'm selling books over the internet. And I said, this is not going anywhere. I don't think we should do that. So we didn't want a third of the company. We took some cash from him. That was a mistake. But I wouldn't have predicted what he did. He produced. Mark Zuckerberg, when he was starting Facebook, I knew of it, and I looked at it and I said, this is not going anywhere. So you never can tell who is really going to make it and not make it. And what it takes is certain qualities of things. But to say there's no one thing that I can say you could do to be successful, but the qualities I look for when I'm hiring people are these. Number one, reasonable intelligence. I don't want geniuses. Geniuses are impossible to manage. They might be brilliant, and maybe they're going to change the world, but they're impossible to manage. So I want reasonably intelligent people who work reasonably hard. They're not obsessive compulsive to the point where nobody wants to deal with them because they're working so hard and they have nothing else in their life, but work reasonably hard, not just 9 to 5, 5 days a week. I want people that are I would say have mastered some skills in terms of learning how to write. They learn how to talk publicly. I like people who have some humility. I also think that having people who are highly ethical is very important. People that are unethical are probably cutting corners. It's probably not something for me, and I don't think you'll be, in the end, that successful. People that know how to share the credit. As Ronald Reagan famously said, there's no limit to what humans can accomplish if they're willing to share the credit. So sharing the credit, I think, is very important as well. I think looking for people that want to do something useful with their life, but not just accumulate money so they can say how rich they are, but figure out that people who have a desire to give back to society in some way, so when they make a fair amount of money, they can give back. I'm looking for those kind of qualities in people, and being people who are a bit of a self-starter and have some ability to initiate things. So those are the things I'm looking for. And generally, if you look at people who are leaders, you'll see that they have a large number of those qualities.
So sticking with the Carlyle Group, and maybe not just the people, maybe talk about the firm now.
Okay.
So, you started alongside of other well-known firms, KKR, Apollo. How do you distinguish Carlyle at that time? And then maybe talk a little bit about how you evolved the firm. You famously raised $5 million and then now over $200 billion.
When I started Carlyle, there were roughly 200 private equity firms in the whole world. Today, there are between 8,000 and 9,000, depending on your count. So it's a big business. Of the 8,000 or 9,000, there are only 4 or 5 that are publicly traded that have, let's say, $200 billion of assets under management. They would be Blackstone, Carlyle, Apollo, and the KKR. All have different characteristics. When I started Carlyle, some were not even around. I started Carlyle in 1987. Blackstone was started in 1985. Apollo, I think, in 1990. And KKR was much earlier, about 10 years earlier, probably in 1977 or so. I came up with an idea that changed the face of private equity. Nobody's given me a royalty payment on it, and nobody's patting me on the back on it. But anybody that builds a company has to do something that nobody else has done. You can't just copy somebody else. So I had an idea, which I'll describe to you in a moment, what it was, and others have followed it. Some have done it maybe better than we have done it. But here was the idea. Private equity firms basically were started as venture capital firms. They called them adventure capital in the early 60s. And they came up with a brilliant idea of how to get people to give them money. In the history of the money management, the way that it historically worked, people gave you money and you managed it for, let's say, a 1% fee, and you put it into 2 types of things. Fixed income, which is bonds. Let's say you get your money back and you get some income before you get your money back. Or equities, where you get a piece of the profits and it theoretically goes up. Equities theoretically go up about 6% a year on average, maybe fixed income historically 2 or 3%. The people that came up with adventure capital came up with an idea that they would start new companies in a way that had never been done before. And they said to their initial investors, we don't know what the companies are, but give us money before we actually have the companies. You commit to give us money down the road as well when we find these companies. So you were getting money committed to you, but you didn't actually have anything to invest it in. And secondly, they said, I want 20% of the profits, which was unusual. The first venture capital deals were spectacularly successful. People were making 50% annualized rates of return, 60%, so more and more people went into it. The first buyout businesses done in the late 60s, early 70s were then called Bootstrap Deals, and those deals were ones where you borrowed 95% of the purchase price, you put in 5% from equity you cobbled together, you fix the company up, you make it much more efficient, you make the managers owners as well, they have an incentive to work harder, and then you ultimately get good returns if you know what you're doing, and those returns in the early deals were 50, 60%. So the industry blossomed and it grew. But the industry, and the venture capital industry, the buyout industry, if you had a fund, you had to spend 100% of your time managing that fund. The partnerships said, we'll give you money, $100 million to manage. On this basis, you get 20% of the profits and so forth, but you can't do anything else. You have to spend 100% of your time managing that fund, which seems to make sense. I said after we raised our $100 million fund in 1990, look, I have an idea to build a Fidelity of private equity, which is to say have many different funds and to take advantage of our brand name and then globalize it. And people laughed at the time. They said we were just building a franchise. But what enabled Carlyle to get off the ground and grow was that after we had our $100 million fund, I told my partners, you manage that fund, you invest it. I'm going to go do a venture fund, recruit the people, raise the money, you manage it, oversee it. Then I'm going to go do the same in real estate and growth capital and so forth. And then the theory was, if you like us in buyouts, why don't you give us a chance in venture capital? If you like us in venture capital, give us a chance in growth capital. So we did that, and then I went around the world globalizing it by hiring people in Europe and Asia and so forth. And obviously the other firms I mentioned, Blackstone, Apollo, KKR, have now done the same. They don't give me credit for it, but they've basically done that. So we built these global asset management companies, and the differences between us are modest in some respects. We all have talented young people. We all try to add value to these companies. In the end, some are better at real estate than others. Some are better at private equity. Some are better at credit. But they're all basically kind of doing the same thing.
So let me ask you this follow-up question from the previous answer you given. You were talking about one of the characteristics that you look for is ethics or integrity.
Right.
I've heard in one of the interviews that I was watching that you also feel that good leaders have convictions. So I would love to hear a little bit about what your convictions are, and in particular, have you deprived yourself of something that you would seek because of your convictions?
Well, in convictions, I mean, you have to believe in something. You can't just say, I don't really believe in this company. I don't really believe in my own abilities. You have to believe in your own abilities and your ability to get something done. And leaders are people that feel that they have an idea that others should follow, and ultimately through the means I talked about, writing or oral persuasion or example, you get other people to follow you. Sure, I've had conviction. If I look at a company, I say this is a good company, this is a bad company. I have my convictions, and I generally thought that most people like their own ideas better than they like somebody else's ideas, as a general rule of thumb. So it's rare that somebody says, I have terrible ideas, and I think I like somebody else's ideas. Maybe occasionally you might give somebody some credit for having a good idea, but generally people like their own ideas. That's generally the way it works. So I guess I'm no different. I like my own ideas about how to build a company or how to manage a business. And though I have lots of mistakes I've made, I generally follow my own convictions about what I think is best. And like all of you, and you go through life, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and you recognize, you'll learn from your mistakes. So, but you have to have some conviction about what you want to do and where you want to go with your life.
So do you have a conviction that the recession is not going to be coming?
Well, let me explain the recession situation. On average, since World War II, we've had recessions every 7 years. And recessions can be deep or they can be modest. The U.S. government does not tell you if you're in a recession. They outsource that to the Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They tell us you're in or you're out. Theoretically, we ended in June of 2009. So we're now 10 years into a growth cycle. Very unusual. So at some point in my lifetime, there's going to be another recession. Economists or business people are really good about telling you why you went into the recession. They're not telling you exactly when the recession is going to happen. Clearly, we are due for a recession, but we put it off by borrowing a lot of money, tax cuts, artificially low interest rates, and those are probably two of the factors that enable us to keep going this way. I think when I was in the White House, the Carter's inflation advisor used to go out and say when Carter was running for re-election, I think we're going to be in a recession during 1980. And Carter would call him into the Oval Office and say to Fred Kahn, look, don't say that because I'm running for re-election. I don't want to scare people. When you use the recession word, the R word, it scares people. Just don't ever say that again. And he said, well, I'm an honest person. What do you want me to do? He said, just don't use the R word. So from then on, Fred Kahn would say, I think we're heading into a banana in 1980. And he would use the word banana because he knew reporters wouldn't put that in the headline. I think we are probably heading into a banana at some point, but I don't know when. And clearly the game in this town is to figure out whether the recession will occur before or after the election. And if I had to bet today, I suspect that the recession will occur whenever it does occur after the election, because I think interest rates are probably going to come down a little bit more. I think we still have some growth effects from the tax cut. And I think it would take an exogenous event to push us into a recession. Exogenous event being Iran knocks out all of the Saudi oil capabilities, and maybe others in the Middle East that they knock out. So you have a gigantic spike in oil prices. This time the spike hasn't occurred for reasons I could explain, but something that's not predictable could get you into recession. Last time, subprime mortgages kind of got us into recession. Nobody predicted that. Right now, I can't see a recession imminently, but I suspect we'll see it in our lifetime. We'll obviously have another recession.
Do you think the odds change for the recession based on who wins the election?
Well, it's hard to say exactly because it's hard to know, what the policies would be of the Democrat if he or she, a Democratic leader, got in. But I suspect it would be very difficult to have another 4 years, if we don't have a recession this 4 years of the Trump administration, to go another 4 years without recession. I think that would be hard to do. It hasn't ever happened, anything like that. But I don't know if it makes a difference whether Democrat or Republican comes in. I think it depends on what policies they implement and who the Congress is and what the Congress does.
Right. So, David, let me ask you, shift gears a little bit. There's been so much technological change, a lot of disruption taking place, artificial intelligence coming into play. How does that impact the finance market overall? And also, what should a school of business be doing in terms of preparing its students best, especially in this area?
Clearly, technology is changing the world in a more rapid way than usually it does. We've had technology changes since the Gutenberg Bible a long time ago, but technology changes used to be maybe something novel would come along every 50 years, 25 years. Now you see something novel coming along every day practically. So the technology change is so dramatic that no one can really keep up with it, I guess, other than to recognize that changing is occurring so rapidly that you've got to kind of keep your eyes out for what's going on and be more attentive to technological changes. The best thing that business schools, I think, can do for students is to not try to predict exactly where the world's going to go. That's difficult, and what technological changes are going to occur. Teach people how to think, how to reason. Don't teach people how to memorize so much, but how to think, because inevitably life is about thinking through problems. So teaching people how to think through problems, and again, teaching people how to really write in a clear way, teaching people how to speak effectively in a clear way, and teaching people how to be leaders in a way that makes them have enough confidence to go out and try to lead other people and not always be a follower. There's nothing wrong with being a follower in life, I suppose. In fact, in some ways, everybody's a leader. They're a leader of their family, they're a leader of this organization or that organization. But generally, people who are real leaders of society, there's not that many of them. And not everybody has to be a leader. You can lead a happy life being a modest leader or a follower. But if you really want to change the world or do something of significance, i.e. making your parents proud of what you've accomplished, you probably have to be more assertive than just the average person. But anybody can get through life by being a follower, I suspect, and have a reasonably happy life if your ambitions are modest.
So following up on making your parents proud, maybe speak about your philanthropic activities, whether that be patriotic or signing the Giving Pledge. How did you decide on these activities?
Yeah, philanthropy is an ancient Greek word, more or less, that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks, but that's what we've bastardized the word into. So we think here's the greatest philanthropist by how much money they've given away, as opposed to their great ideas they might have had. Or like Teach for America was an idea that Wendy Kopp had. I think it's a great philanthropic endeavor, but now she didn't give money to it, so she's not listed as a philanthropist. when you have a lot of money, I didn't have a lot of money growing up, as I said. Now I have a lot of money by normal human standards. But when I meet with Bill Gates, I always feel poor because he's got a lot more money than I have. But by normal human standards, I have a great deal of money. So when you have a great deal of money throughout history, what did people do with it? Well, many times people would spend it dramatically and just buy lots of material possessions. If you have so much money you can't spend it all on material possessions, what you can do is you can do what the ancient pharaohs did. They had material possessions and they bought more, and they were buried with it for the afterlife. They thought maybe they need these material possessions in the afterlife. There's no evidence you really can use material possessions in the afterlife. So therefore, if you have a lot of money and you don't want to think building a pyramid is a good idea, what you get down to is this. You can spend it all and just have a nice life, what people might call a nice life, just spending things, buying material possessions. In the end, there's probably limits to how much you want to buy or how much you can do of that. So then you're reduced to giving it away. And you can give it away three ways. One, you can give it away to your children, typically, your spouse. And 99.9% of the people who've given away money throughout history give it to their children and their spouse. That's the most convenient way and the most common way. Today, more and more people have so much money to give away. They recognize that if they give a staggering amount of money to their children, it's not necessarily going to make the children better. And you can still give their children a fair amount of money and give away a lot. So then the question is, do you give it away while you're alive or you wait till you're dead? I am amazed at how many people die with billions of dollars and they give it away upon their death. You'd think, why wouldn't they give it away while they're alive? There was somebody I know not too long ago who, at 96 or so, he decided to give a large gift upon his death. And I said, why doesn't he give it away now? I mean, how much longer is he waiting for to spend the money? So in my own case, I didn't think I would be somewhere when I died that I could necessarily see the money being expended by my executor. So I decided that I wanted to give it away while I was alive. And around that time, I was thinking about it. Bill Gates called me, came over to have lunch in my office, and explained the Giving Pledge. And I said, okay, I will do that. And the Giving Pledge basically says you have a certain net worth. I think it's $1 billion. You agree to give away half your net worth upon your death or during your lifetime. It's a voluntary thing. And if you say, I'm going to give it away upon my death, and then you die and you don't give it away, we can't disinter you. We can't do anything to do that. But it's a kind of a voluntary thing. And most people who have acquired a fair amount of money realize that they get more pleasure out of giving it away and doing something useful than buying another Picasso or buying another house. So in my case, I get much more pleasure in giving it away than making it. And I came from very modest circumstances, and to be able to give away money and give back money to my country or the schools that gave me a scholarship is a lot of pleasure. So I enjoy it. And it's interesting. When I was building Carlisle, my mother, she was not high school educated. She was relatively simple in her outlook on these things. She never actually called me and said, I'm proud of you. You're my only child. You're building a company. You just took a company public and so forth. I guess she may have been proud, but she didn't call me and tell me that. When I started giving away the money, she would always call me and say, now I'm proud of you. You're doing something useful. So I tell people that if you can make your mother proud, especially if she's Jewish, that's a great pleasure in life. And patriotic philanthropy kind of came about, like many things in life, by serendipity. If I had said I'm going to hire McKinsey, Bain, or BCG and say, come up with an idea how I can do something for the country, I'm sure they would have had a good idea, or after a year or so, come up with something or another. But this has happened by serendipity, and sometimes those are the best things. Somebody invited me to go look at a viewing of the Magna Carta. I didn't know why the Magna Carta was being viewed in New York. I thought it was only one copy, and it was in London. It turns out there are 17 copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, one in the Australian Parliament, and one had been owned by Ross Perot. He was putting up for sale, and I was told by the person at this Sotheby's that it would probably be sold to somebody outside the country. So knowing enough about American history to realize I wanted to keep the one copy that could possibly be kept in the United States here, I decided to buy it the next night. I did, and then I said I will put it on permanent loan to the archives. And then I got in the habit of buying other documents and putting them on display so people could see them, on the theory that when people see these original documents as opposed to the copies, they tend to get more excited about learning about the history of it, or they get more excited about wanting to learn more about our country's history. And right now, sadly, our country's history is not known by people very much, because you can graduate from almost any college in the United States without having to take an American history course. Civics courses are going way down in terms of they're being taught in junior high school and high school. And amazingly, a survey was recently done that showed that the citizens in 49 out of 50 states who are native born in this country could not pass the citizenship test that immigrants have to pass in order to be citizens. Citizens who are people born from elsewhere, they take the citizenship test. 91% of them pass. You need a 60 out of 100 questions to pass. But 49 citizens out of 49 out of 50 states, native born, they could not pass this basic test, which shows you we don't really know much about history. And then what also happened is when the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I decided I would put up the money. I figured it would help the government get it done more quickly. And then ultimately the Congress said, well, we don't get any credit for doing anything, so we put up some money too. So I said, okay, fine. So I did that, and then I realized there were other buildings that people would visit more, and people could maybe learn about more about history if they visited them. So, Montpelier, James Madison's home; Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home; Mount Vernon, George Washington's home; the Washington Monument, Iwo Jima Memorial, Arlington House, other things, Kennedy Center, other things. I try to put this money in, and then I've called it Patriotic Philanthropy, which means reminding people of the history and heritage of our country, the good and the bad. So when I did Monticello, I visited Monticello. I thought it needed some work, and I said, I will put up the money to fix it, but I want you to make sure that everybody knows that it was a slave plantation, and Thomas Jefferson owned more than 200 slaves. So let's build out the slave quarters so that we know the good and the bad of American history. And that's what I've been trying to do, is to remind people a little bit more about the history and heritage of our country, on the theory that if you know more about the history of our country, you're more likely not to repeat the mistakes that some people made before. Now, there's no guarantee of it, but I think there is an advantage to learning more about our history.
Thank you, David. I think we will want to open for some questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, please line up in the center aisle. But before, as people start lining up, maybe I would love to hear a little bit about your show, the David Rubenstein Show. I have watched personally a few of those interviews, and they are just absolutely entertaining. And tell us more about how you choose your guests and
Let me tell you how it came about.
Unique interview style there.
Let me tell you how it came about. It's like many things in life, by happenstance. So what happened is, Carlyle used to have prominent people come into our investor event. We have an investor conference of 1,000 people. So I would hire a former president of the United States, former secretary of state, former prime minister. They would come and make a speech, but they're generally not good speak makers. They were boring. So I'm paying somebody $200,000, $300,000, and they're putting people to sleep. So I said to people in the future, I'll tell you what, why don't I just interview people? And they said, the same fee? Yes. Okay. So I'm paying the same fee. They were interviewed, and I would use a little humor to make it lighter, and people liked it. Around that time, I was asked to be the president of the Economic Club of Washington by Vernon Jordan, a prominent businessman and lawyer in Washington. And I said, okay. And he said, all you have to do is get one speaker every quarter, and then just get questions from the audience, read the questions that come up in the cards, and that's it. So I started doing that, and I realized the business people were boring speakers too. And then the cards would come up from the members, and they were terrible questions. So I would make up questions as I was, pretending I was reading a question. And then, they were funny, and so I kept it lively. So eventually somebody from Bloomberg saw it and said, why don't you do this on television and so forth. So what I do is I try to interview somebody about their background, what made them a leader, and I have a book that'll be coming out next year on some of those interviews, which just try to put in a simple terms what each of these people thought made them leaders and what are the qualities and characteristics of it. And the style I use that you referred to, I try to have a conversation. It takes 45 minutes to do that. We cut it down to maybe 25 minutes or so. And I don't use notes because I do a lot of preparation, so I kind of can remember the questions. And then I just enjoy having a conversation, so it looks like I'm not using notes. But, people seem to like it, and I use some humor, and people seem to sometimes remember the humor more than the substantive stuff. But it's fun.
Okay, there's a huge line here. So if you would be, we'll go ahead and start taking questions. If you would state your name and keep the question short with and whatever you say with a question mark at the end, that'll be very useful so that we can get as many questions as we can.
Can do that. My name's Suzanne, and first, thank you, Mr. Rubenstein, for joining us. It's a great privilege to have you here. My question is, you spoke a little bit about how your business edge with Carlyle was in the 90s when you started to globalize before other firms did. And I'm wondering how you've seen the opportunity and the business edge in emerging financial markets, the emerging financial ecosystems develop. The business edge and opportunity in emerging financial markets, how you've seen that evolve over time.
In the early 1980s, a man working at the World Bank went in front of an audience when he was trying to raise money to buy stocks in countries like Taiwan, Thailand, so forth. The World Bank thought it would be a good thing to have better stock markets in these not well-known countries. He called it third world country fund, and people said, well, that's pejorative. He said, well, should I call it an undeveloped world fund? And he said, people said that's even worse. So he came up over a weekend with a suggestion from his daughter with the phrase emerging markets. And everybody likes to emerge, nobody likes to be submerging, so it stuck. And basically, emerging markets became everything but the United States, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Today, the emerging markets have obviously emerged, so that China and India are among the biggest economies in the world. Emerging markets are generally good places to invest if you have certain understandings. They grow at a higher rate, higher GDP growth rate. They have fewer government subsidies that you have from Social Security funds, other things that require the government to go into debt sometimes to pay for them. They have younger populations, and they generally prices are cheaper because there's less competition to buy the assets. So the theory was if you buy something cheaply in an economy where it's growing more rapidly, younger population, less government constraints, you're probably going to get a higher rate of return. That's the theory of emerging market investments. It turns out that over the last 30 years or so, emerging market investments and private equity have yielded roughly the same return as developed market investments. And therefore, people are now beginning to say, well, if I'm going to get the same rate of return in a developed market as an emerging market, why take the risk of an emerging market? Because you have currency risk, higher corruption, higher illiquidity risk. The bloom is off the rose in emerging markets now because the currencies have gone way down against the dollar. Some of them are in recessions and so forth, but it'll come back in time. But I think the risks in emerging markets is that you just have a lot more corruption you have to deal with. You have the accounting is not as good, and quality of management is not as good, but the growth rates can be staggering. So if you invested in China 10 years ago or 15 years ago, with all the problems that China has had, you're probably going to do reasonably well because a lot of those companies that have been started, like Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth, have done spectacularly well because of the large population. But right now, I'd say we invest in emerging markets, but we're very leery of the risks in some of the emerging markets. Some are much more complicated than others.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is CG. Thank you for spending the night with us tonight.
Can you speak up?
Can you hear me?
Could you speak up so I can hear you?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, maybe that's not working. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is CG. Thank you for spending the night with us tonight. And then my question is, how does your investment strategies change over the years?
How do your investment strategies change over the years?
Well, if you have one investment strategy, like Warren Buffett seems to, value investing, you can pursue that same strategy, I guess, if you're very good at it. But as a general rule, we try to see how economies are evolving, what industries are likely to be more high growth than others. So you have to be flexible, in my view. And while you have certain core principles about what you're going to do, you have to recognize that times are changing. So investing in certain areas are not going to be attractive 10 years from today, but they might be attractive today. And investing in some things 10 years ago might have been attractive, but it won't be today. So you just have to use your intelligence and have a big network so you can find out what is actually likely to grow at a good rate and what makes sense for the situation you're going to find over the next 5 years or so. So you have to evolve and you have to be very attentive. You can't just be shuttered in your thinking and just do one thing without recognizing how the world's changing.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Rubenstein. My name is Ruben. I'm in the School of Business. And you mentioned in your talk about how you came from modest beginnings, but subsequently attained success with the Carlyle Group. My question, Mr. Rubenstein, is with income inequality being a foremost political issue on many Americans' minds, what role do you believe business leaders, such as yourself, have to play in advocating on this important topic?
Well, income inequality obviously has gotten worse in recent years and probably hasn't been this bad since the late 20s. Another related issue is social mobility. It's one thing to have income inequality, but a lack of social mobility is a different, but maybe a greater problem, because if people at the bottom don't believe that they can rise to the top, then you're going to have a very static society. I always believe in the American dream, and I believe that you could rise to the top through a lot of luck and hard work and so forth. And Mike Milken is actually, who I interviewed on the stage maybe a year or so ago, is building the museum of the American Dream right across from the Treasury Building. And the American Dream is something that many people have bought into. Some people think it's not that different in other countries as well, but I think America is a little bit different. I think in believing in that I could do this, I did buy into the American Dream. On income inequality, I don't know that there's any one answer. If there were, everybody running for president would say, I have an answer for income inequality, and nobody seems to be talking about it because it's a systemic problem that's very deep. I don't think the problem is solved by having higher tax rates on wealthy people. It's not, there aren't enough wealthy people to make a difference. You can take all the wealth away of the people in the Forbes 400. It's not going to solve the problems at the bottom strata of our society. The thing I mentioned earlier is one of many possible solutions, which is to make sure people learn how to read. We have this high illiteracy rate in this country, far higher than other comparable countries, and that is one thing, but also making the K-12 system better. As you know, we have 1.5 million high school students dropping out every year. High school dropouts, even if they're literate, have a very modest chance of being as successful as they would be if they got a high school degree and maybe even a college degree. So I think education would be what I would say is the most important thing. But again, if I had a solution for this problem, I would be in Iowa, but I'm not there.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Rubenstein. I am Serena, and I'm a junior from GW, and I'm also a potential candidate to maybe join Carlisle next summer. You really have a magic when you're interviewing other people to bring out something very different, and you really ask some really magical questions. And would you be able to share some of your magic here with us?
Okay. First, I tell people I am not a journalist. A journalist's job, because that's the job, is to try to have somebody make some news, in some cases say something they would prefer not to say. So I try to get people to be calmed down, and I very often will give them the questions in advance to show them that I'm not going to embarrass them. I'm not a journalist. I'm not going to embarrass them. In addition, I try to use humor to relax them a bit. And I think when you can sense that they're relaxed and there's some humor, that you can ask them about their life. In all my interviews, I try to take people through the trajectory of their life. But everybody has a story about how he or she grew up with certain constraints, problems, and so forth, and how they overcame them is what people like to talk about. So I think it's a question of being prepared, make sure you've done the research, make sure the person feels comfortable with you, and I typically know the people I'm interviewing, and I've interviewed them sometimes before, and then using humor as a way to take the edge off of more serious points, and also listen to what the person says, and then pivot from it. So in other words, if I have 20 questions in my mind, I memorize them, and I don't listen to what the person says, I'm going to miss some key points. So listen to what the person says and then pivot from it to kind of follow up and so forth. I am honestly surprised at how many people think that what I'm doing is a little different or unique, because to me it comes naturally. But I'm not a journalist, and I guess there aren't that many interviewers out there now who are doing it. And one other thing I try to do is try to let the person answer the question too. There's some interviewers who try to show you how prepared they are by making elaborate questions, and then there's no time for the interviewee to say much. But I'm happy it works out. I just wish I had started this younger in my life, but I also wish that there was a carried interest in interviewing. There's no carried interest in interviewing, so I have to keep my day job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I hope it's okay I ask a question. I'm a professor, I'm not a student. Is that okay? Is that all right with you?
I assume the question won't be as good as a student's question.
Probably. So over the last 30 years, it's very clear private equity, if you could bet on any asset class, private equity would be the one that you'd want to put all your capital to. Right now, there's like 3 main issues that private equity faces that are not really talked about. I'd like to get your insight on. One is the attractiveness of private equity due to accounting smoothing. 2, what will happen to private equity if debt rates change drastically in a short period of time where funds need to roll their investments and don't have pools of capital to draw from? And third, private equity has faced in the last 10 years, they have started to buy more of each other's assets. And if the main thrust of private equity is that they fix businesses, how many times does a business need to be purchased back and forth? And that's the question. And I don't mean that because I look at private equity, and I would love it if we were called the Rubenstein School of Business, by the way. So I ask because I'm concerned about it. So I'm interested to get your insight on this.
Let me take those questions in the reverse order that you asked them. Every time I go to an investment committee, the thing that I hate the most is what's called a secondary buyout, which is to say a buyout firm is selling it to somebody else, another buyout firm. I hate these deals because I say, if the buyout firm is, done what it's supposed to do, what are we going to do? That's going to be much better. And then I always get the argument, well, they need to sell to get an exit for their firm. They'd rather sell their mother, but they have to get an exit so they can go raise another fund. Or we have some special talent with our manager we're going to bring in. We can do better jobs. As a general rule of thumb, I try to avoid secondary buyouts. However, we have done a number of them, and in recent years they seem to have worked out because you maybe make an acquisition that might change the company. You bring in a different manager, but I prefer not to do them. And now we have tertiary buyouts, and there's one deal I saw recently where it was 6 or 7 times a buyout firm had bought it from one buyout firm another. I agree with your premise that there shouldn't be that much value to add, but sometimes some of the best known private equity deals have been where one private equity firm sold it to another and the other one then made tons of money. I would prefer not to take that chance though, and it's an issue. I don't like those deals, but in this environment, you have to do these deals if you're going to invest money for this reason. The stock market is very high. Because it's so high, there's not any taking, there are very few take private deals because the market's so high, we can't pay a premium to the stock market. So if you can't take companies private, and there are fewer companies that take private, there used to be 7,200 companies that were publicly traded, now there are 3,600. So there are fewer companies you can take in the United States. There are very fewer companies that take private, and the prices are so high. So you're therefore reduced to buying assets from other private equity firms or subsidiaries of public companies or private companies. So it's just, if you have so much money as we now have, you're going to do deals, you rationalize it. Another reason for it is this. In the old days of private equity, you were trying to get 20% net internal rates of return, 20% annualized rates of return. Today, because interest rates have been low for such a long time and other asset classes, as you pointed out, haven't done that well, if you can get a 13 or 14% annualized rate of return for your investor, they're happy. So even if you're buying it from another private equity firm and they made 4 times their money, you might still do reasonably well. And I hate when I buy it from a firm and I'm giving them a profit that's going to make them 3 times, 4 times their money. I hate that, but I get worn down after a while, and people convince me it's a still good deal, and we've done some deals that work that way. On debt, your point is that the debt is too, debt right now is very cheap, and then when interest rates go up, you won't be able to roll over the debt. Is that your point?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just a concern for those equity holders in the fund.
Now, most people today are not rolling over debt. Now, you're talking about, let's suppose you borrow money for 5 years. Before 5 years is up, you probably are going to figure out a way to exit. But if you can't, that means you do have a problem with your company. It's probably not doing that well because you want to exit before 5 years comes up. If you need to roll over the debt, you're probably going to be able to roll it over, but you'll pay more for it. But I don't think the interest rate increase is going to be so high as to be a big problem, and this is the reason. In the old days of private equity, an RJR deal was done by KKR. There was 95% debt, 5% equity. Today, the deals are 40 or 50% equity. Therefore, when you're rolling over debt, you're rolling over a much smaller part of the capital structure, and therefore, if interest rates go up, it's not going to kill you so much. And your first question was?
About the smoothing effect of the returns that private equity benefits because they are fair valued, but manager gets to decide when those marks actually hit. And as a result, the asset class looks more attractive on a risk-adjusted basis because the returns are determined by the manager until the exit on the interim. And so as a result, when you're comparing the volatility, if you're a pension manager, if I'm going to invest in public equity versus private equity is much more attractive because the moves are much slower than the market moves.
Private equity has grown to be a business that now has $2 or $3 or $4 trillion in the ground and or available to be called down. The reason is, as you kind of suggested, over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years, private equity has outperformed every other asset class almost every period of time. Obviously, there are different types of private equity, but private equity has outperformed public equities and public fixed income. As a general rule, people think that because the private equity people have their money alongside the investors, they really only get a big piece of the profits if they make a profit for the investors above, let's say, a preferred return of 8% or something. So people feel that it's probably more likely that the private equity person is going to work harder to make sure they get some return. The returns historically have been very good. And also now, people are pouring money into private equity because they think it's a recession hedge. They think that in the last recession, hedge funds got clobbered, public equity got clobbered, and what did very well was private equity, in part because if you play along with the system, i.e. you're in the fund and it goes down, if you wait a while, it'll come back. If you're in public equities, what happens is people see the market going down, they sell, and then when the market's going back up again, they buy, which is the wrong thing to do. But private equity, if you stay part of the fund, and it goes down, you don't sell. While the markdown might occur, you're probably going to get ridden up, and private equity did very well through the last recession, so why people think we'll do well in the next recession. But anyway.
All right. Well, thank you. We'll take one last question, if it's a very short question, because we are already at the top of the hour.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mary. I'm a GW alum. And my question has to do with diversity in the financial services or investment business. There's not been a lot of diversity in the workforce. And I commend your firm for creating your council back in 2013 and committing to hiring more people of color and more females. But how much longer do you think it will be before we see more women and people of color at the management level, at the board of directors level and things like that? Because at your firm and at others, it's overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male.
Well, I think you're correct. I think it'll be a while, only because the industry hasn't been under as much pressure as maybe it should. Law firms today are probably 50% female and 50% male, and I think the leadership is probably increasingly female. Hedge funds and private equity firms are not as good as law firms in this regard, in my view. And I think even investment banks are doing better than hedge funds and private equity firms. Private equity firms are more sensitive to this issue than they used to be, but we haven't done as good a job as we probably should in letting people rise to the top. Carlyle's done a pretty good job in having women and some minorities in senior management, but it's harder than we would like to hold, because somebody's very talented, we want them to rise up. They often say, well, I'm going to start my own firm, and I don't really need to be part of your firm. But it's a serious problem, and all of us are trying to do much more, because it's a theory is not that it's a good thing to do for society necessarily, but we'll get a better rate of return. The theory is that if you have a more diverse leadership base, you probably will make better decisions about money management and how to make companies work and so forth.
I would agree with that.
I'm sorry?
I agree with that.
Right.
That having more voices, having more points of view will enhance not just your business, but society.
Look, one of my daughters wanted to get into private equity. She said, I said, you want to work for this firm or that firm? She said, I don't want to work my way up those totem poles. Impossible. So she set up her own private equity firm, and she owns her own private equity firm. And more, I think women will do that. More minorities will do that. I think it's a good thing. But I think it's not going to change as rapidly as I think it should. But there is some progress being made.
Well, thank you for the work you've done on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. And it's always good to end when there is agreement. So there is agreement now. All good things do come to an end. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
It's been a very great pleasure for an insightful conversation. I also want to thank all of you and those who are watching online, and invite you to the next session of George Talks Business, which will continue on Thursday, October 3rd, when our guest will be Corinne McCormick. She is also a GW alumni and a founder of a designer eyewear company. The conversation will be on how you can build a multi-billion-dollar business, a multi-million-dollar business.
Well,
by the way, why not $1 billion?
Yeah, why not?
Of course, we have already had that conversation, so now we're going to have the $1 million conversation. We'll go in reverse order. As a reminder, thank you again, Steve, for sponsoring and for supporting the George Talks Business, and see you all at the next George Talks Business. Have a great night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.